So I said there's a conceptual notion, and that's partly disputed. And historically during the Cold War, it was very much divided. Those who said, no, real human rights are only the civil and political ones. That's still a view held by many, but certainly many governments, and particularly Western, including our own Canada, strongly held this view. And others who said, no, it's the economic social. Even those who said, well, it's both. There's a big dispute about where do you start, which ones come first, that kind of thing. Many people, including major human rights organizations, that are still not very convinced about group rights, for example, and will contest that, for example, cultural rights exist, either conceptually or positively. Now, my answer to all of that is, by the way, in positive law, they do exist because there are actually provisions, there are actually instruments, and then you have to get into some detail about, well, who's agreed to them and so forth and so on. But the idea that they don't exist, well, they do exist. But this first part about kind of what are they links to the next, which is, well, what's the story around them? Now, you're right that this largely emerged out of the end of the Second World War and the crisis that then exists, or crises, which were not only practical. There was for a lot of people today don't realize that amongst the hardest period of time was immediately after the Second World War, when people couldn't be fed because the social infrastructure and economic had been destroyed. So there was literally starvation in 1946 in Europe, after the war. And so the crises, there was a crisis of displacement and migration, which gave rise to the High Commissioner for Refugees, which was initially thought to be just a couple-year program to kind of get everybody back in their homes in Europe. But no, today we're 70 million displaced and refugees around the world. So there were crises, not just the war. But that allowed for people to, in the world, many countries and governments to say, you know what? We can't afford the kind of reproduction or risks that we've just confronted, many of them, and we have to create a system. And the system was created around the UN Charter, around the Bretton Woods institutions, the international financial system. There was a vision, the Atlantic Charter, Roosevelt and Churchill, and that met off the coast of Canada, of course. And so there was this whole vision of kind of reconstructing a new world order, is what it was. And part of it, because of the Holocaust, because of the cost of the character of total war and so forth, was to include human rights. That was a radical move. And, a cornerstone of that was the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, because they said, there's something here, that's the ultimate group right? The right to exist for a group. And to say, well, it's not just that there was a lot of bad stuff happen, but there are some particular things that happen here, and we got to stop it. And so human rights was this cornerstone, one of the three objects and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. And linked to that, in my view, is this prohibition of genocide, saying no state within its own jurisdiction, territorially, over people, is permitted to go after and seek to destroy, in whole or in part, a group of people. Citizens or not, doesn't matter, which was part of the problem under the Third Reich. It was also that they were, the Jews and the Roma were not foreigners. They were people in the Third Reich and so forth. And at that time, the rule basically was that the German state could do what it wanted. Now we say, no, you can't. The state is obliged at a minimum to respect these fundamental standards. So, however, very quickly, when the Cold War started to take off, there was this divide, left and right, Soviet world, Western world. And a lot of it, we have to be honest about the story here, was still the dominance of the Northern Hemisphere. Decolonization had not taken place. So, the articulation, even in positive law, of the framework of human rights was largely a Western project. I think that no one can deny that. It was a Western, Northern, victors of the Second World War. It was Roosevelt and so forth, and Eleanor Roosevelt and so forth. There were others, very famously, Chinese member, a Lebanese member of the Human Rights Commission and so forth. But, there were only 50 states of the United Nations, 50. We have almost 200 now. There were almost no African states, very few. There were some important Latin American states played a role, and they tried very hard to get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the charter itself. They wanted to include it, and in San Francisco that failed, and then they got the Universal Declaration later, 3 years later. But the Latin Americans were quite progressive in this. But there was very little voice from, don't forget, India was not an original member of the United Nations, the largest country in the world at that time in population, because it was still a colonial possession of the United Kingdom. So, some white guys on a little island in the North Atlantic controlled crazy large part of the world that didn't have voice. So it took until 1947 and when India became independent and so forth. So we've had a long progress since then to fatten out the corpus of international human rights law and the norms. And the voices have been added after decolonization in the 1960s. And we're finding now more and more in the last 20 years, civil society voices outside the state saying more and more things, indigenous voices, women's voices, and others, the oppressed. Human rights does two things. Human rights ultimately provides a shield for protection of abuse of power, and that's one of the metaphors that's often used, a shield. The other is this flame, this idea that values, Prometheus's idea of the spark of creativity that's in and value in every human being, and needs to shine, needs to have, oxygen and opportunity. And we're finding as the world has evolved, and maybe it's partly technology and so forth, more and more of those voices are demanding to be heard and are being heard, and that's sent place. Now, is it working? So that's a tough question. And there's been a lot of discussion the last 10 or 15 years precisely around this question. And some people have felt that it's failing. But here's a few of my quick thoughts on this. I think the idea has been enormously successful. Human rights as a concept is, they say the Universal Declaration of Rights is now the most translated document in the world in all sorts of indigenous languages. People use this terminology of human rights. They claim rights in every corner of the world in every language. I think that's because they didn't just hear about it, but because it genuinely resonates. There's something deep and valuable in it that touches every human being. We can feel it. And so this resonance, the language and concept of human rights, I think has been an undoubted success, a global success. If we watch the news right now, what's going on in Hong Kong, and we're having all these kind of revolutions, right? The colored revolutions, the umbrella revolutions, all sorts of places in the world, people are standing up and claiming what's going on in the streets of not just the United States of America, but around the world. They're using this language. So this is the first thing, in my view, undoubted success. Second thing, the corpus has been developed. I mean, we now have courses and we teach and we give degrees and there are fat books and scholar all around human rights. So, arguably, there's even a small industry of human rights. But we have now enormous number of instruments of detail. We have mechanisms. We have organizations like Amnesty International, medicine, even humanitarian ones like Médecins Sans Frontières. We should not forget, they all began, many of them 30, 40, 50 years ago, by one or two individuals. Amnesty was two lawyers who were sitting in Portugal and saw someone arbitrarily detained, arrested in front of them. And they went back home and wrote a letter in the Observer, I think, newspaper. And, now Amnesty has like 8 million members around the world, in every country in the world and so forth. So there's been this kind of development where not only the resonance of the idea, but the kind of mobilization around it, again, in my view, has been an enormous success. And I already mentioned governments and states have incorporated a lot of this in their domestic law. Now, where it's been failing, arguably, and this is really kind of goes to your third question, where's it going? Has been, for many people, they're saying, okay, great idea, means a lot to me. I'm ready to kind of adhere to it, or it helps express or articulate what I believe. And interesting that there are mechanisms and there are standards. But now more and more people the last 10, 15 years have been asking a simple question. So what difference does it make? Does this actually translate into some change in my life? For the people, for George Floyd in, Minneapolis, were his human rights operationally available to him? For too many people now, for quite a long time, and maybe again, technology has made this visible, the gap between the promise of human rights, the conceptual assertion of the Universal Declaration of Rights, and even the kind of machinery around it, the instruments, the mechanisms, and so forth, is far removed. The gap is too large from what we see at the same time to be the lived reality of so many people.